Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of the Virginia mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. On a cold February morning in 1917, Sheriff Thomas Garrett of Augusta County, Virginia, received a visit that would change everything he thought he knew about criminal investigation. A young woman named Catherine Marsh, 20 years old and visibly distraught, walked into his office carrying a leather glove. She placed the glove on his desk and told him it belonged to a murder victim. When Garrett asked how she knew this, Catherine explained that when she touched the glove, she had experienced the woman's final moments, had felt her terror, her pain, her desperate struggle to survive. She knew where the body was hidden. She knew who had killed her. And she knew because she had lived through the murder herself, through the victim's eyes, through the victim's flesh. This is the story of Catherine Marsh, and what her impossible ability revealed about the darkest corners of Virginia in 1917. The year 1917 found America on the brink of entering the Great War in Europe. President Wilson had just been inaugurated for his second term. The nation was transforming rapidly, modernizing, urbanizing, leaving behind the agrarian past that had defined it for centuries. But in the remote valleys and ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, life remained much as it had been for generations. Small communities existed in near isolation, connected by rough roads, sustained by farming and small industry, largely untouched by the changes sweeping through cities hundreds of miles away. Augusta County in western Virginia was mountain country, rugged terrain where the Blue Ridge Mountains rose dramatically from the Shenandoah Valley. The county seat, Staunton, was a prosperous town of about 10,000 people, connected by rail to Richmond and points north. But venture into the mountains surrounding Staunton, into the narrow valleys and isolated settlements, and you found communities that seemed caught in time, places where old ways persisted, where everyone knew everyone, where the outside world felt very distant indeed. Catherine Marsh was born in May 1897 in a settlement called Hebron Hollow, approximately 12 miles northwest of Staunton. The community consisted of perhaps 30 families, mostly farmers who worked the difficult mountain soil and raised livestock in the narrow valleys. Catherine's father, Jonathan Marsh, owned a modest farm and worked part-time as a carpenter, building and repairing structures throughout the region. Her mother, Alice, kept house and raised their 4 children in a frame house Jonathan had built himself in 1895. According to records preserved in the Augusta County Historical Society, Catherine attended the local school from age 6 until age 16. The school, a one-room building heated by a wood stove, provided basic education to children from several nearby settlements. Catherine was remembered by her teachers as an exceptionally bright student, particularly gifted in reading and writing. She completed the available curriculum by age 15 and spent her final year at school helping the teacher instruct younger children. In 1913, at age 16, Catherine left school and began working as a seamstress, taking in mending and sewing from families throughout Hebron Hollow and neighboring settlements. She was skilled with needle and thread, could create clothing from patterns, could repair anything made of fabric. The work provided modest income and kept her occupied in the years when most young women her age were courting and preparing for marriage. But Catherine showed little interest in courtship. She was quiet, serious, given to long periods of solitary reading or walking alone in the mountains. Some neighbors found her strange, too bookish, too independent for a girl. Others simply accepted that Catherine was different, that she would find her own path in her own time. Her parents, though sometimes puzzled by their daughter's solitary nature, did not push her toward conventional expectations. Everything changed in January 1917. According to testimony later given by Alice Marsh to investigators, Catherine woke on the morning of January 7th complaining of severe headaches and sensitivity to touch. Any contact with her skin caused intense discomfort, as if her nerves had become hyperactive, translating simple touch into pain. Alice tried various remedies, cool compresses, herbal teas, rest in a darkened room. Nothing helped. The sensitivity intensified over 3 days until Catherine could not bear even the touch of her own clothing against her skin. On the 4th day, January 10th, the sensitivity vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Catherine woke feeling normal, the pain and discomfort completely gone. She got dressed, ate breakfast with her family, and seemed entirely recovered. Alice, relieved, assumed her daughter had suffered some temporary illness, perhaps an unusual reaction to something she had eaten, or a mild fever that had run its course. It was that afternoon when the family first realized something fundamental had changed. Catherine was helping her mother with laundry when she picked up one of her father's work shirts. The moment her hand touched the fabric, Catherine gasped and dropped the shirt as if it had burned her. When Alice asked what was wrong, Catherine struggled to explain. She had felt something, seen something, experienced something when she touched the shirt. She had been her father, had experienced his memories, had felt what he felt while wearing that shirt. She had been in multiple places, doing multiple things, living through hours of her father's life in the space of a few seconds. The family initially dismissed this as imagination or some lingering effect of her recent illness. But over the following days, the pattern repeated. Catherine would touch an object and would immediately experience flashes of memory associated with that object. A cup would give her the sensations of everyone who had drunk from it. A chair would show her everyone who had sat in it. A book would flood her mind with fragments of everyone who had read it. The experiences were brief, rarely more than a few seconds, but intensely vivid and often overwhelming. Catherine described the sensation as being pulled out of her own consciousness and thrust into someone else's. For those few seconds, she was not Catherine Marsh, but whoever had last interacted with the object she touched. She felt their emotions, perceived through their senses, existed as them, rather than as herself. When the experience ended, and she returned to her own body, she retained memories of what she had experienced, fragments of other people's lives now residing in her own mind. The family was disturbed, but tried to help Catherine learn to manage her new ability. She began wearing gloves constantly to avoid accidentally triggering these experiences. She became careful about what she touched, avoiding objects that might contain intense or disturbing memories. She learned that older objects, things touched by many people over many years, produced more chaotic and overwhelming experiences than new objects touched by only 1 or 2 people. For several weeks, Catherine adapted to this new reality. She continued her sewing work, though now she had to be careful about touching the clothing she repaired, wearing gloves whenever possible, focusing on her own sensations to avoid being pulled into the memories embedded in the fabric. She explained to her family that most of the memories she experienced were mundane, fragments of ordinary life, eating meals, doing chores, nothing particularly interesting or useful. The ability was strange and uncomfortable, but she was learning to live with it. Then, in early February, Catherine touched something that would change everything. A traveling peddler named Morris Henderson stopped at the Marsh house selling household goods and small luxuries. Catherine, who needed new sewing needles, came out to examine his wares. Among the items Henderson offered was a pair of fine leather gloves, ladies' gloves with delicate stitching, offered at a remarkably low price. Catherine, without thinking, picked up one of the gloves to examine the quality of the leather. The moment her fingers touched the glove, she was no longer Catherine Marsh, standing in her family's yard. She was someone else, a woman, running through darkness, terror flooding through every nerve. She could feel cold air on her face, feel her lungs burning as she gasped for breath, feel the sharp pain in her side where she had been struck. Behind her, she could hear heavy footsteps, someone pursuing, someone catching up. She tried to run faster, but her legs would not obey, exhaustion and injury slowing her to a stumble. The footsteps grew closer. A hand grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around. She saw a face, a man's face twisted with rage, and then she felt intense pain as something struck her head. The world spun, darkness closing in, and the last thing she felt was cold earth against her cheek as she fell. Then nothing. Death. Death! Catherine dropped the glove and collapsed. Her father caught her before she hit the ground. When she came to moments later, she was trembling violently, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak. It took nearly an hour before she recovered enough to explain what she had experienced. She had lived through someone's murder, had felt the victim's terror, pain, death. The memory was now part of her, as vivid and real as her own memories. More vivid because it was so intense, so traumatic. Jonathan Marsh demanded to know where Henderson had obtained the gloves. The peddler claimed he had purchased them from a general store in Waynesboro 2 weeks earlier, along with other items for resale. He knew nothing about their previous owner, had simply bought them as part of a lot of miscellaneous goods. Jonathan, protective of his daughter and deeply disturbed by what she had experienced, sent Henderson away and burned the gloves despite Catherine's protest that they might be evidence of a crime. But Catherine could not forget what she had experienced. The murder victim haunted her thoughts. She did not know the woman's name, had not seen enough through the victim's eyes to identify the location or the killer with certainty. But she knew the murder was real, knew it had happened recently, knew that somewhere a woman had been killed and her body hidden, and no one knew about it except Catherine and the killer. After days of internal struggle, Catherine convinced her father to take her to Staunton to speak with the sheriff. If she had witnessed a murder, even through this impossible means, she had an obligation to report it. Perhaps the authorities could identify the victim. Perhaps they could use the information to find the killer. Jonathan was reluctant, fearing his daughter would be dismissed as insane or attention-seeking. But Catherine was insistent. They made the journey to Staunton in mid-February 1917. Sheriff Thomas Garrett was 51 years old in 1917, a practical man who had served in law enforcement for 23 years. When Catherine Marsh walked into his office with her impossible story, his first instinct was to dismiss her politely and send her home. Young women suffering from hysteria or seeking attention were not uncommon in his experience. But something about Catherine's demeanor gave him pause. She was not dramatic or theatrical. She described her experience in precise, clinical detail, showing obvious distress but maintaining composure. She seemed genuinely disturbed by what she had experienced, not excited or proud of her claimed ability. Garrett asked Catherine to describe everything she could remember from the victim's perspective. Catherine closed her eyes and recounted the experience. The victim had been a woman, probably in her 20s or 30s based on how her body felt. She had been running through woods at night, fleeing from someone. She had been struck or stabbed in her right side, causing pain and bleeding, but not immediately fatal. She had been caught, struck on the head with something heavy, possibly a rock. She had fallen face down on cold ground and died within seconds. The description was specific, but not specific enough to identify a particular victim or crime. Virginia had no shortage of unsolved disappearances and murders, particularly involving women, particularly in isolated rural areas where crimes could go unnoticed for extended periods. Garrett made notes of Catherine's account, but told her honestly that without more details, there was little he could do. If she remembered anything else, any detail that might identify the victim or location, she should contact him immediately. Catherine left the sheriff's office disappointed but not surprised. She had no proof, no physical evidence beyond her own testimony, and her testimony was based on an ability that no rational person would believe existed. She returned to Hebron Hollow and tried to resume normal life, though the memory of the murder victim continued to haunt her. Then, 2 weeks later, everything changed. A farmer named Robert Keene, working land near Waynesboro, discovered human remains buried in a shallow grave in a wooded area on his property. The body was that of a woman, estimated to have been dead for approximately 1 to 2 months. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Clothing and personal effects found with the body identified her as Elizabeth Hawthorne, age 28, who had been reported missing from Waynesboro in late December 1916. When news of the discovery reached Staunton, Sheriff Garrett remembered Catherine Marsh's visit. The timing matched. The cause of death matched. The location, wooded area near Waynesboro, matched the general description Catherine had given. Garrett sent a deputy to Hebron Hollow to bring Catherine back to Staunton for further questioning. Catherine, when informed of the discovery, was both vindicated and horrified. Vindicated because her experience had been real. The murder had actually happened. Horrified because she now knew the victim's name, could put a real person to the terror and pain she had experienced. Elizabeth Hawthorne had been a real woman with a real life, and Catherine had lived through her final moments. Sheriff Garrett questioned Catherine extensively about her experience. She provided additional details she had not mentioned in her initial report. The killer had been a man, tall, heavy build, wearing work clothes. Elizabeth had known him, had spoken his name in her mind, as she tried to plead with him. Catherine had not heard the name clearly through the chaos and terror of the victim's final moments, but she thought it might have been Henry, or Harry, or Harvey, something similar. The killer had been enraged about something, though Catherine had not understood what through the fragmentary memories. Garrett cross-referenced Catherine's description with known associates of Elizabeth Hawthorne. One name stood out: Harold Benson, age 32, a laborer who had been courting Elizabeth in the months before her disappearance. Witnesses had reported seeing them argue publicly in December. Harold had been questioned briefly after Elizabeth's disappearance, but had claimed to know nothing about her whereabouts. He matched the general description Catherine had provided: tall, heavy build, work clothes. Garrett brought Harold Benson in for questioning. Confronted with the discovery of Elizabeth's body and with details that matched Catherine's account, Benson eventually confessed. He had been involved with Elizabeth. They had argued about his drinking and gambling. The argument had escalated. He had struck her in anger, causing her to flee. He had pursued her into the woods, caught her, and in his rage had struck her head with a rock. He had buried her body in the wooded area near Waynesboro, and had kept her gloves as a morbid trophy before selling them to a peddler weeks later. The confession corroborated everything Catherine had experienced. Harold Benson was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death for the murder of Elizabeth Hawthorne. During the trial, the prosecution did not mention Catherine Marsh's involvement, or the method by which certain details had been uncovered. Garrett had decided that introducing Catherine's testimony would only complicate the case and potentially allow the defense to claim the investigation was based on mysticism rather than solid police work. The conviction relied on Benson's confession and physical evidence, not on Catherine's impossible ability. But word of Catherine's involvement spread anyway. Newspapers got hold of the story, sensationalizing it, describing Catherine as the psychic witness who had solved a murder through supernatural means. The publicity was intense and unwelcome. Catherine, who had only wanted to help identify a murder victim, found herself the subject of intense scrutiny and skepticism. Some people believed her story and sought her out, asking her to help find missing relatives, to solve cold cases, to use her ability for good. Others dismissed her as a charlatan or attention seeker, claiming she had somehow learned details of the crime through conventional means and was fabricating the psychic angle to gain notoriety. Still others, particularly in religious communities, declared her possessed or in league with dark forces, her ability evidence of demonic influence rather than genuine phenomenon. Catherine wanted nothing to do with any of it. She had not asked for this ability, had not sought publicity, had only wanted to report a crime. But the attention would not stop. Sheriff Garrett, recognizing that Catherine might be useful in other investigations, approached her with a proposal. Would she be willing to examine evidence in unsolved cases, to see if her ability could provide leads that conventional investigation had missed? Garrett promised to keep her involvement confidential, to protect her from publicity and harassment. Catherine was reluctant. The experience with Elizabeth Hawthorne's glove had been traumatic. Living through someone else's murder was not something she wanted to repeat. But Garrett emphasized that there were other victims, other families seeking answers, other cases where her unique ability might make a difference. After considerable internal struggle, Catherine agreed to help on 2 conditions. Her involvement would remain completely confidential, and she would only examine evidence in cases where victims had already been confirmed dead. She could not bear the idea of experiencing murders while the victims were still alive somewhere, suffering. Between March and August 1917, Catherine Marsh assisted in the investigation of 6 unsolved murders in Augusta County and surrounding areas. She worked in complete secrecy, meeting with Sheriff Garrett in private, examining evidence from cases that had stalled. The arrangement was simple. Garrett would present her with objects belonging to victims, usually clothing or personal effects, and Catherine would handle them without gloves, allowing herself to experience whatever memories were embedded in the objects. The process was extraordinarily difficult for Catherine. Each time she touched a victim's belongings, she relived their final moments. She experienced their fear, their pain, their desperate struggles to survive. She felt knives entering flesh, bullets tearing through bodies, hands closing around throats. She died repeatedly, experiencing death from different perspectives, different causes, different levels of agony. Each experience left psychological scars that would never fully heal. But the information she provided was invaluable. In one case, she handled a scarf belonging to a woman who had been found strangled in an alley in Staunton. Through the victim's memories, Catherine saw the killer's face clearly. A man with distinctive scars on his left cheek. She provided a detailed description that led to the identification and arrest of Jacob Peters, a drifter with a criminal record who had been working in Staunton when the murder occurred. Peters matched the description perfectly, including the scars. He confessed when confronted with evidence placing him near the scene. In another case, Catherine examined a coat belonging to a man found stabbed to death outside a tavern. Through the victim's memories, she experienced his final conversation with his killer, heard the argument that had led to violence, recognized the killer's voice as someone the victim knew. She provided the victim's perspective on what had been said, enabling Garrett to identify the killer as the victim's business partner who had been embezzling funds and killed to cover his crime. Case after case, Catherine's ability provided breakthroughs that conventional investigation could not achieve. By August 1917, she had contributed to solving 6 murders, leading to 5 arrests and convictions. The 6th case remained unsolved because the killer had died before he could be apprehended. But Garrett had confirmation through other evidence that Catherine's information had been accurate even in that case. The toll on Catherine was severe. By late summer, she was suffering from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. She experienced nightmares almost nightly, reliving the murders she had witnessed. She developed an intense aversion to being touched, fearing that any physical contact might trigger her ability. She lost significant weight, unable to eat properly, her appetite destroyed by the memories of violence and death constantly replaying in her mind. Dr. Martin Holbrook, a physician in Staunton who was treating Catherine for what he termed nervous exhaustion, documented her deteriorating condition in medical records that still exist in the Augusta County Medical Society archives. Holbrook noted that Catherine exhibited symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma: insomnia, panic attacks, inability to concentrate, persistent intrusive thoughts, and what he called morbid preoccupation with death. Most disturbing to Holbrook was Catherine's description of how her ability was changing. Initially, she had needed to physically touch objects to experience their embedded memories. By August, she found that simply being near certain objects would trigger visions, particularly objects associated with violent or traumatic events. She could walk into a room and immediately sense if something there contained traumatic memories, even without touching it. The ability was intensifying, becoming harder to control, gradually consuming her entire existence. Holbrook wrote in his notes, "Miss Marsh describes her consciousness as being invaded by the memories and experiences of others. She can no longer maintain clear boundaries between her own identity and the identities she experiences through contact with objects. She reports feeling as if she is becoming less herself and more a collection of fragmentary other selves, each with their own memories and traumas. This condition, if it continues to progress, will result in complete psychological disintegration." In September 1917, Catherine told Sheriff Garrett she could no longer help with investigations. The psychological cost had become too high. She was losing herself, her own memories and identity becoming confused with the memories she had absorbed from victims. She needed to stop before the ability destroyed her completely. Garrett, though disappointed to lose such a valuable resource, understood and agreed. He had seen the toll the work had taken on Catherine. He released her from their arrangement and promised again to keep her involvement in the solved cases completely confidential. Catherine returned to Hebron Hollow in October 1917, hoping that distance from the work would allow her to heal. But the damage had been done. The memories of the 6 murder victims she had experienced remained vivid in her mind, as real as her own memories. More real because they were so traumatic. She could not escape them. Everywhere she looked, she saw the faces of killers, felt the fear of victims, experienced the moment of death over and over. Her family tried to help. Alice Marsh consulted with local folk healers, seeking traditional remedies for spiritual disturbances. Jonathan Marsh contacted ministers from several churches, asking them to pray for his daughter or perform rituals of cleansing or protection. Nothing worked. Catherine continued to deteriorate. By November, she was barely functional, spending most days in bed, speaking little, eating almost nothing. It was during this period that Catherine made a decision. She could not continue living with the memories of violence constantly replaying in her consciousness. But she also could not simply ignore her ability, knowing that it could help solve crimes and bring closure to grieving families. She decided to create a record, to document what she had experienced, to provide testimony that might be useful even after she was no longer able to continue the work herself. Between November 1917 and January 1918, Catherine wrote a detailed account of the 6 murder cases she had helped solve. She described each victim, each killer, each murder, as she had experienced it. She included information that had not been part of official investigation records, details known only to her through her impossible ability. She wrote with clinical precision, forcing herself to relive the traumas in order to record them accurately. The manuscript ran to more than 200 handwritten pages, a chronicle of violence witnessed from the perspectives of those who suffered it. Catherine completed the manuscript in late January 1918. She sealed it in a waterproof container and gave it to her father with specific instructions. If anything happened to her, if she died, or if her mental condition deteriorated to the point where she could no longer function, the manuscript should be given to Sheriff Garrett. It was not for publication, not for sensational purposes, but as evidence that her ability had been genuine, that her testimony had been accurate, that the information she provided had come from a real source, even if that source defied conventional explanation. In February 1918, Catherine's condition improved slightly. The intensive work of writing the manuscript had been therapeutic in an unexpected way. By forcing herself to confront and document the traumatic memories, she had gained a measure of control over them. They still haunted her, but she could function again, could engage with daily life in ways she had not been able to do for months. It was during this period of relative stability that Catherine made a disturbing discovery. Her ability, which she had hoped would fade with time and disuse, was actually continuing to develop in new directions. She found that she could not only experience memories embedded in objects, but could also perceive residual traces of violent events in locations where they had occurred. Walking through the woods near her home, she would suddenly experience flashes of past violence, fights that had taken place, accidents that had occurred, deaths that had happened sometimes decades or even centuries earlier. The entire landscape became a palimpsest of trauma. Layers of pain and fear and death accumulated over generations, all of it accessible to Catherine whether she wanted to perceive it or not. The mountains themselves seemed to hold memories, the rocks and trees and streams carrying echoes of every tragedy that had occurred in their presence. Catherine could not escape it. Everywhere she went, she was surrounded by ghosts, not literal spirits, but impressions of past suffering that her abnormal consciousness could perceive. In March 1918, Catherine attempted something she had been afraid to try before. She deliberately touched objects belonging to her family members, hoping to experience happy memories, normal memories, something positive to balance the darkness she had been exposed to. The experiment was partially successful. Touching her mother's sewing basket, she experienced pleasant memories of Alice sitting in the evening light, mending clothes while humming hymns. Touching her father's hammer, she experienced the satisfaction he felt building things, creating structures that would shelter and serve his family. But mixed with these positive memories were others less pleasant. She experienced her parents' worries about money, about their children's futures, about their own mortality. She felt her father's guilt over times he had been harsh with his children, her mother's grief over babies lost before birth. Even ordinary objects belonging to ordinary people contained layers of pain and struggle alongside moments of joy. Catherine realized that suffering was universal, that everyone carried trauma, that the difference between her family and the murder victims she had experienced was one of degree, not kind. This realization was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it meant that her own suffering was part of the human condition, not something uniquely monstrous. Disturbing because it meant that the darkness she perceived was not exceptional, but normal. That pain and fear were woven into the fabric of human existence, that even the happiest lives contained profound sadness. Catherine began to develop a philosophy to make sense of her ability and what it revealed. She wrote about this in letters to Dr. Holbrook, who had become something of a confidant during her treatment. In one letter dated April 1918, she wrote, "I have come to understand that my ability is not really about seeing into the past or reading memories from objects. What I perceive are the emotional and sensory impressions left by consciousness as it interacts with the physical world. Every time we touch something, every time we occupy a space, we leave traces of our awareness embedded in matter itself. Most people cannot perceive these traces, but I can. My seizure, or whatever happened to me, removed some filter that normally prevents consciousness from perceiving the persistence of past awareness. I see what everyone leaves behind, the ghostly impressions of every moment of experience." This theory, whether accurate or merely Catherine's attempt to rationalize her experiences, led her to a disturbing conclusion. If consciousness left permanent traces in matter, if every experience created impressions that could be perceived by someone with the right sensitivity, then in some sense the past never truly ended. Every moment of suffering, every act of violence, every death ever experienced continued to exist as a kind of recording in the physical structure of the world itself. The universe was a repository of all consciousness that had ever existed, all awareness that had ever been, all experiences that had ever occurred. And Catherine, through her abnormal perception, could access this repository. The implications terrified her. It meant that suffering was eternal in a sense, that pain never truly ended but persisted as an indelible impression in matter. It meant that the victims whose deaths she had experienced were not simply gone, but continued to exist in some form, their final moments preserved forever in the objects and locations associated with their murders. It meant that in a very real sense, Elizabeth Hawthorne was still being murdered, would always be being murdered. Her terror and pain an eternal present, accessible to anyone with the ability to perceive it. In May 1918, Sheriff Garrett contacted Catherine with an urgent request. A child had gone missing from Staunton, an 8-year-old girl named Mary Patterson, who had disappeared while walking home from school 3 days earlier. Garrett believed she had been abducted and possibly murdered. He had evidence. A hair ribbon found near where Mary was last seen. Would Catherine be willing to examine it, to see if she could determine what had happened to the child? Catherine wanted to refuse. The thought of experiencing the fear and suffering of an 8-year-old child was unbearable. But she also knew that if Mary was still alive somewhere, every hour mattered. If Catherine could provide information that led to the girl's rescue, she had an obligation to try, regardless of the cost to herself. She agreed to examine the ribbon. The moment Catherine touched the ribbon, she knew the child was dead. She experienced Mary's abduction, felt the child's terror as a man she did not recognize grabbed her and forced her into a wagon. She felt the desperate hope that someone would help, followed by the crushing realization that no help was coming. She experienced hours of fear and confusion, unable to understand why this was happening. And then she experienced the moment when the man, frustrated by the child's crying, struck her head against something hard. The world spun. Pain exploded through Mary's skull, and then nothing. Death had come to an 8-year-old child, sudden and senseless and incomprehensible. Catherine dropped the ribbon and collapsed, sobbing. When she recovered enough to speak, she told Garrett that Mary was dead, had been dead for at least 2 days. She described the killer as best she could from the child's perspective. A man in his 40s or 50s, balding, with rough hands and clothing that smelled of animals. She described the interior of the wagon, details that might help identify it. Most importantly, she had caught glimpses through Mary's eyes of where the wagon had been going, a remote area, possibly a farm, with a distinctive red barn visible from the road. Garrett's deputies searched for properties matching the description. They found 3 possibilities. On the third property, a farm owned by a man named Chester Wolfe, they discovered Mary's body hidden in a cellar beneath the barn. Wolfe was arrested, eventually confessed to the abduction and murder, and was convicted and executed. Justice was served, but at what cost? The experience with Mary Patterson destroyed Catherine. Experiencing the murder of an adult had been traumatic, but experiencing the murder of a child from the child's perspective was something entirely different. She had felt an 8-year-old's confusion and terror, had experienced the incomprehensibility of senseless violence through a child's consciousness, had died as a child dies, not understanding, not able to make sense of the destruction of everything. She knew. The memory would haunt Catherine forever. After the Patterson case, Catherine told Garrett she could never help with another investigation. She had reached her absolute limit. No case, no matter how important, was worth what it cost her to assist. Garrett, deeply affected by Catherine's condition, agreed and promised never to contact her again about police matters. He thanked her for her service, acknowledged the sacrifices she had made, and released her completely from any obligation. Catherine returned to Hebron Hollow in June 1918, and this time she did not recover. Dr. Holbrook, visiting monthly to check on her condition, documented her progressive deterioration. She experienced constant nightmares, waking terrors, where she relived the murders she had witnessed. She developed severe anxiety that made it difficult for her to leave her room. She refused to touch anything that might trigger her ability, wore gloves constantly, and recoiled from any unexpected contact. Most disturbingly, Catherine reported that the boundaries between her identity and the identities she had absorbed were breaking down. Sometimes she would forget who she was, would believe herself to be Elizabeth Hawthorne or Mary Patterson, or one of the other victims. These episodes of confusion grew more frequent and lasted longer. Catherine Marsh, the girl who had grown up in Hebron Hollow, was disappearing, replaced by a fragmented collection of trauma and suffering absorbed from others. In December 1918, Catherine made a final request of her father. She wanted to die, but could not bring herself to commit suicide. She asked if he would help her, if he would make it easy and painless, if he would release her from the suffering that had become her existence. Jonathan, horrified, refused absolutely, but he recognized that his daughter was beyond help, that nothing medicine or prayer or time could do would heal what had been broken in her mind. On January 15, 1919, Catherine Marsh simply stopped. She had been sitting by the window of her room looking out at the winter landscape when her mother came to bring her lunch. Alice found her daughter still sitting in the chair, eyes open, but not breathing, no pulse, no sign of life. Catherine was 21 years old. Dr. Holbrook, summoned to examine the body, could find no cause of death. Her heart had stopped. Her brain had ceased functioning. But why remained a mystery. He concluded that Catherine had died of what he could only describe as total system failure, as if her body had simply decided to stop maintaining life. Catherine was buried in the small cemetery above Hebron Hollow, on a hillside with a view of the mountains. Her gravestone bears her name, her dates, and a single line. She saw what others could not. The manuscript she had written, documenting her experiences with the 6 murder cases, was delivered to Sheriff Garrett as she had requested. Garrett read it, verified that the details matched his investigation records, and then sealed it in the county archives with instructions that it be kept confidential for 50 years after his own death. Garrett died in 1943. The manuscript was unsealed in 1993 and is now available to researchers with proper authorization in the Augusta County Historical Society archives. Reading it is a disturbing experience. Catherine wrote with brutal honesty about what she had experienced, holding nothing back, describing in precise detail the murders she had witnessed from the victims' perspectives. The manuscript stands as testimony to both her extraordinary ability and the terrible price she paid for using it. What do we make of Catherine Marsh's case today? The documentation is extensive. Her contributions to 6 murder investigations are verified through police records. Dr. Holbrook's medical notes document her deteriorating condition. The manuscript she wrote provides detailed testimony that matches facts known only to investigators. The evidence strongly suggests that Catherine genuinely possessed some form of psychometric ability, the capacity to perceive memories or impressions associated with objects. Modern psychology would likely diagnose Catherine with severe post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from repeated exposure to traumatic memories. But this diagnosis does not explain how she acquired those traumatic memories in the first place. How did she accurately describe details of murders she had no conventional way of knowing about? How did she identify killers she had never met? How did she locate bodies buried in remote locations? Some researchers have proposed that Catherine might have been an exceptionally gifted cold reader, someone who could extract information from subtle cues and present it as psychic knowledge. But this explanation fails to account for her accuracy regarding details that were unknown to anyone except the killers themselves. Details later confirmed by confessions and evidence. Catherine knew things she should not have known, could not have known through any conventional means. Another theory suggests that Catherine might have been an unconscious accomplice to the murders, present at the scenes but psychologically blocking the memories through dissociation, later recovering those memories and believing them to be Bowie's psychically obtained. But this theory is contradicted by her movements and activities being well documented through family testimony and other witnesses. Catherine was probably elsewhere when the murders occurred. She was not present, could not have witnessed them through normal sensory channels. The most disturbing possibility is that Catherine genuinely possessed the ability she claimed, that consciousness somehow leaves traces in matter, that objects and locations retain impressions of experiences associated with them, and that under certain rare circumstances, human beings can perceive those impressions. If true, this would require reconsidering fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality, about whether awareness is contained entirely within individual brains, or whether it can somehow imprint itself on the external world. Dr. Holbrook, in his later writings about unusual cases in his medical career, devoted several pages to Catherine. He concluded, Miss Marsh's abilities, whatever their source, were genuine. I witnessed her accuracy in multiple instances where fraud or coincidence could not explain her knowledge. Whether she truly read memories from objects or accessed information through some other paranormal means, I cannot say. What I know with certainty is that exposure to traumatic information, regardless of how that information was obtained, destroyed her mentally and physically. She was a casualty of her own gift, sacrificed to the pursuit of justice in cases where conventional investigation had failed. History should remember her sacrifice, even if it cannot explain her ability. Sheriff Garrett, in his own later years, spoke occasionally about the cases Catherine had helped solve. He always referred to her as his secret weapon, the investigator whose methods he could never publicly acknowledge but whose contributions had been invaluable. In a private letter written in 1940, he reflected, Catherine Marsh solved cases I could not have solved through any normal means. She saw things that should have been impossible to see, knew things that should have been unknowable. I exploited her ability, used her to bring killers to justice, and in doing so, I contributed to her destruction. She gave everything to help victims she had never met, families she did not know, and it killed her. That burden weighs on my conscience still. The families of the victims Catherine helped identify never knew of her involvement. The killers she helped catch never knew how they had been discovered. The public never learned that a young woman with an impossible ability had been instrumental in solving some of Augusta County's most disturbing crimes. Catherine worked in secret, suffered in secret, and died in secret. Her contributions known only to a handful of people sworn to protect her privacy. But her story persists, passed down through the Marsh family, recorded in sealed archives, remembered by researchers who study unusual cases in criminal history. Catherine Marsh, the genius girl who could read memories from objects, who experienced murders through victims' eyes, who sacrificed her sanity and ultimately her life to bring justice to the dead. If you found this case as disturbing as I did, let me know in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, what time it is where you are, and whether you believe psychometry is real, or whether Catherine's abilities must have had some other explanation. Share this story with anyone interested in the mysteries of human consciousness, the unsolved questions about the relationship between mind and matter, and then the forgotten heroes of criminal justice who worked in shadows and suffered in silence. Because some abilities are too terrible to possess, Some knowledge comes at too high a price. And some people, like Catherine Marsh, give everything they have to help others, even when that help destroys them completely. She saw what others could not see, knew what others could not know, and paid the ultimate price for her impossible gift. Welcome to the horrifying case of Catherine Marsh. Welcome to the story of the girl who experienced murder from the victim's perspective. And welcome to a mystery that continues to haunt everyone who studies it. A question that has no answer. How did she know? And what does her knowledge tell us about the nature of consciousness, memory, and the persistence of human experience in the physical world? This is the story that refuses to be forgotten. The case that challenges everything we think we know about the limits of human perception. Catherine Marsh, the genius girl who could read the past, who lived through horrors no one should experience, who died young having seen too much, felt too much, known too much. Her gravestone stands in Hebron Hollow Cemetery to this day, weathered by more than a century of seasons, marking where a remarkable and tragic life came to its end. She saw what others could not. 4 words that cannot begin to capture what she experienced, what she sacrificed, what she gave to bring peace to the dead and justice to the living. Remember her name. Remember her sacrifice. And remember that the boundaries between past and present, between consciousness and matter, between the living and the dead, may not be as solid as we believe. Catherine Marsh proved that, in ways that science still cannot explain, in ways that destroyed her even as she used them to serve others. This is her story, and it will haunt you.